Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Mavuika guide. Mavuika is the newest 5-star character, well, released alongside Silali, who just came out in version 5.3, and so today we're going to cover everything you need to know about this character. We're going to cover Mavuika's best builds, teams, playstyle, weapons, artifacts, rotations, and much more, all in one video. Before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream both sites on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's talk about Mavuika. Alright, so starting things off, what does Mavuika actually do? Well, firstly, for Mavuika's elemental skill, this is a pretty unique ability. When you use it, it will start by giving Mavuika her maximum Night Soul points of 80, entering the Night Soul blessing state, and then doing something different based on if you tap or hold it. In fact, if you tap this ability, there will be a fire ring around your active character that will deal Night Soul aligned pyro damage passively once every 2 seconds, even from off field. This can allow Mavuika to apply pyro and deal some damage even from off field if you choose to tap her skill. Now, on the other hand, if you hold her skill, here she'll enter a very unique state riding her motorcycle. This motorcycle is obviously very unique to Mavuika. It is a motorcycle that can fly and swim, so cool for exploring, but it's also a core part of how your Mavuika deals damage. In fact, when you are on this bike, Mavuika's normal charge and plunge attacks will be converted to deal Night Soul aligned pyro damage. You'll also deal damage to enemies that you sprint through, but crucially, Mavuika will have new scalings here that are quite high on top of being pyro. Mavuika can normal attack on her bike, plunge on it, or crucially, charge attack on it by spinning in a circle, hitting everything she comes into contact with. Her charge attacks have a pretty high scaling and do come out fast, meaning that it's something you want to maximize when you are playing Mavuika as a main DPS, spinning around doing donuts, but more on that shortly. Also, once your skill is active, you can tap it again to swap forms between either the ring behind you or being on your bike. Your skill will end once Mavuika finishes consuming all of her Night Soul points, and her skill has a cooldown of 15 seconds. Now, for Mavuika's Elemental Burst, this is an ability that will do a few different things. Firstly, it doesn't rely on energy, and instead costs Fighting Spirit. Fighting Spirit is something that you'll get as nearby party members consume Night Soul points. This can be Mavuika herself, but it can also crucially be other characters, like other supports from Natlan, that can consume Night Soul points efficiently and give your Mavuika Fighting Spirit stacks rapidly. Because of this, building a proper team around your Mavuika is important and something we will cover in detail in this video. Outside of just that though, Mavuika can gain some Night Soul points as your active party members' normal attacks hit opponents. You will gain 1.5 Fighting Spirit per normal attack up to once every 0.1 seconds, which is a nice bonus, but the majority of your stacks will come from consuming Night Soul points. Mavuika has a Fighting Spirit cap of 200, and you need half of it, so at least 100, to be able to use her Elemental Burst, through which you will consume all the fighting stacks she has, and then get buffs according to how many stacks you consumed. In fact, when Mavuika uses her burst, she will consume all the Fighting Spirit stacks she has, and a few things will happen. First of all, she will deal a huge hit of pyro damage. Now, while I showcased this off in my previous video, it really is a big hit. As you can see, the scaling, even just at talent level 9, is really big. On top of also, because it's pyro, being easily increased through multiplicative reactions such as melt or vaporize. And it's just a big pyro hit of damage all around you that has good AoE, and once again, it's a really strong ability that can one-shot a lot of things if buffed and built correctly. Now, outside of just that hit of damage though, Mavuika will also enter the Crucible of Death and Life state. Inside of this state, Mavuika will no longer consume Night Soul points and will gain a huge amount of interruption resistance, meaning she won't get knocked around anywhere. On top of just that, the damage of her attacks on her bike, being both her normal and charge attacks, will increase significantly based on how many Fighting Spirit stacks she had when using her burst. Because of this, Mavuika's damage will be significantly amplified after using her burst in this stance that lasts for 7 seconds, giving her a DPS window where she wants to stay on field if played as a main DPS, and we'll get into her different playstyles in the next section, riding her bike for 7 seconds and doing more damage on all of her attacks based on how many Fighting Spirit stacks you consumed. This stance will also expire if you swap out, so you really want to stay on her if you are trying to use her as a main DPS after using your burst. Now, for Mavuika's passives, her first one will give her a 30% attack increase as a nearby party member triggers a Night Soul burst, which is something that will happen passively, so you don't have to worry about it. It's just an attack buff. For your second passive talent, Mavuika will give the active party member a damage bonus after using her burst based on how many Fighting Spirit stacks she consumed. The max amount is 40%, and then it will decay over 20 seconds until it reaches 0. For the most part, this is a solid damage buff to whichever party member is on field, either another DPS or Mavuika herself. Mavuika also has some nice exploration passives, but we're not really going to cover that. Just know that obviously, as with many Natlan characters, they made her more efficient at exploring inside of Natlan in particular. Lastly, before moving on to Mavuika's different playstyles, regarding her talent priority, you typically want to maximize both your burst and your skill. Your burst will generally be your highest priority though, as leveling it will not only increase your massive scaling, your huge hit of damage, but it will also increase the buffs you're gaining, so it's very important. Your skill is also crucial to level though, as it increases the damage of your skill, both the tap variant and the attacks you're doing on your bike when you hold your skill. So even though what you're doing is considered normal or charge attack damage, leveling your skill will increase the scalings of those attacks, meaning that you definitely want to level your skill as well as your burst, and you can ignore your normal attack talent level as it will not increase your multipliers on your bike. Even as an off-field support, leveling both your burst and your skill is important, provided you are using your burst in your team. And keep in mind my talent levels are lower than usual because Mavuika came out with a new weekly boss, so it's impossible to level them up higher, which is something I'm going to be doing in the coming weeks. But keep that in mind, especially as the damage in the footage you're seeing could even be higher. Alright, now with that out of the way, we can talk about Mavuika's different playstyles. Now, firstly, I want to say that if you want to know more about my thoughts on her as a character, a nuanced take on her pull value, and just an honest review, then do check out my last video where I went in depth there so that I could keep this guide a bit more to the point and focused on her kit. With that in mind, Mavuika is a character who is very strong, especially in the right teams, having really good synergy with other Natlan supports, notably the 5-stars like Shilonen and Sitlali, and being someone who can be played both as an on-field DPS or an off-field quote-unquote sub-DPS. This is because Mavuika has a very powerful burst that will deal good damage, and then afterwards she can either stay on field, riding her bike, dealing more good damage that will be buffed for 7 seconds after using her burst, or she can swap out and let the tap version of her skill apply pyro and deal damage from off-field on top of giving your active character buffs. This gives her two distinct playstyles that you can use depending on what you want. Personally, I believe her kit kind of shines more as a DPS, but she definitely is a really strong off-fielder as well. Because her damage is so high, she gives you buffs and pyro application, which is very much appreciated. The pyro application isn't as fast as someone like xxalanchangxx, but it's still more than enough for many teams, which is something I covered once again in my last video. Generally, you want to enable multiplicative reactions for your Mavuika, such as melt or vaporize, because her damage is so consolidated and so front-loaded. Because she does big hits of damage instead of just a bunch of smaller hits, getting however many hits you can to melt or vaporize, like especially her burst, making sure these big hits are as buffed as they can possibly be, will be a huge increase to your Mavuika's personal DPS and therefore to your team's overall damage as well. Mavuika is a character who does incredible amounts of damage consolidated in a few hits, so that is why she has such good synergy with said reactions. But even just outside of that, in general, you want to make sure your Mavuika's hits are as buffed as possible, using as many buffing support characters as you can in her team when played as a DPS to enable her to deal as much damage as she can. Now, what you need to know about her playstyle though is as follows. Firstly, as a main DPS, you will tap your elemental skill on Mavuika and then swap through your support characters using all their abilities before then going back to Mavuika. What this lets you do is have off-field pyro constantly going, allowing you to swirl it, crystallize it, or do anything you can on your other support characters to buff your Mavuika, on top of also dealing some damage and especially consuming Night Soul points, helping your Mavuika stack up her burst passively. Afterwards, you want to swap through your characters using all your support's abilities in whatever order makes sense for your team. So here, for example, I'm making sure to crystallize pyro with my Shilonen, use my Bennett field to increase my active character's attack, and also use Sitlali's skill and burst to not only consume Night Soul points, but also apply cryo, letting my Mavuika melt and also giving her huge buffs. Now, after you use all your support character's abilities, that's when you swap back into your Mavuika, use her burst, dealing a huge front-loaded hit of damage, immediately mounting your bike afterwards, and then spamming charge attacks for the 7 seconds that you're buffed. To maximize your damage, you want to be spinning for the whole time you are buffed, and naturally, if you just kind of hold your mouse down, you will do 8 spins into a final hit. Oh, and do note that you don't actually have to hold your E on Mavuika kind of ever, as your burst will naturally mount you on your bike, and at the start of your rotation, you're tapping your E, so you tap it, you do your support stuff, and then you burst, which will naturally put you on your bike, then you can spin, do your charge attacks, and rinse and repeat. Alright, now for some more advanced stuff, here are some advanced combos you can try out. Firstly, when you're running Mavuika with Sitlali, if all you're doing is spinning normally, you can expect to melt 2 charge attacks. With that said, here are 2 combos that allow you to melt 4. The first one involves simply jumping after doing 4 charge attacks, spinning 4 times, then jumping, and then spinning another 4, allowing you to actually melt 4 charge attacks if done correctly, with only Sitlali as your cryo applier. Now, obviously, if you're running double cryo or just more cryo, you can melt more without the combo, but this is one way to get more damage. Another combo that was discovered a bit more recently that I've actually been favoring involves doing 3 charge attacks into a final hit, which you can get by releasing your mouse button, letting go of your charge attack button that is, dash canceling it, and then doing another 3 charge attacks into a final hit again. This will give you a total of 8 hits, 6 normal charge attack hits, and 2 big ones, still getting 4 melts, and lining it up, if done correctly, for both of your bigger hits to get melted. Oh, and also, you can weave in a normal attack on Sitlali before swapping out of her if you need to remove the pyro pyro aura off an enemy. Keep in mind that there's a lot of combos currently being optimized and discovered, which is kind of why this guide's been taking so long. But for some other ones you should know, for vape teams, there are two common ones that seem very strong. So firstly, you can do 5 spins on your Mavuika, then a dash, which won't consume Night Soul points, and then another 4. This will let you do 9 charge attacks total, dash canceling after 5, and enabling you to get as many vaporizes as possible. Another combo you can do is doing 2 spins into a dash and constantly repeating it for the whole duration of your burst. This is another combo that is quite strong, although a bit annoying in my opinion, but whatever. And it's a combo that can enable you to even run a Hydra support, like potentially Yelan, that you otherwise wouldn't run, but more on that in the team section later. So you can just do whichever one feels the best for you. These are just ways to optimize your Mavuika, even though you may be able to clear everything regardless. Lastly, keep in mind that these combos are just ways to optimize your damage that are purely optional. Obviously, she's a pretty broken character even without them, so I don't want anyone to feel like she's overly complicated. It's just cool, advanced ways to get more out of her if that's something you're interested in. Oh, and also keep in mind that in the footage you're seeing, my Mavuika is on a level 1 weapon, and I believe no artifacts in the melt teams and like a few in the vape teams, basically just making my damage worse so that I can showcase the combo without one-shotting the enemy. Now, as a support character for Mavuika, it's very straightforward. You literally just press your skill and boom, you get off-field pyro passively as your on-field character is attacking. Be sure to also use your burst for big damage, and that's about it. And so overall, it's a pretty positive review, at least strength-wise. I think she's a really strong character, a great carry or support if you're looking for a new one. Don't feel forced to pull, obviously, and understand that she is someone who gets better with a 5-star Natland support, but even just in general, as a character, she is very strong. So if you like her playstyle or want a new carry or support, then once again, I do think that Mavuika is really good and in some ways slightly overtuned. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Mavuika. Now, because Mavuika is a character who can be played as both a DPS or a support, your build can vary based on that. Now, you will notice though that there's a lot of similarities and most of what you're looking for is the same, with the main exceptions being in what artifact set you might choose. In fact, to start things off with your artifact sets, here's what Mavuika is looking for. As a main DPS, it is obvious that your best in slot artifact set will be the 4-piece Obsidian Codex. This set will give you a 15% damage bonus when you're inside of Night Soul's Blessing through the 2-piece effect, and then the 4-piece will give you 40% crit rate once you consume 1 Night Soul point on field. This buff will last for 6 seconds and will constantly refresh as you're on field dealing damage, so it's definitely the best set for Mavuika. As we saw, you can use Mavuika's elemental skill at the start of your rotation to enter your Night Soul's Blessing state and easily consume a point when you swap into her, gaining this 40% crit rate, which is the equivalent of 80% crit damage, so a lot of stats, making it the best in slot artifact set for you and one that I highly recommend as a main DPS. Also, to address a concern you may have, while it is true that Mavuika does not consume Night Soul points after she uses her burst and is spinning around on her bike, the Obsidian Codex's buff is so good that it still is your best in slot option. This is because not only do you gain a ton of stats as we saw, but it's crucially going to be active during the biggest parts of your damage. Mavuika is a character who has very front-loaded damage, a huge burst, and then big hits from her bike. And for these big hits, Mavuika will be buffed because the 4-piece set lasts for 6 seconds. And so even with the uptime that you're getting on Obsidian Codex, it will be your best in slot option because you will be buffed for the biggest hits that you're doing and therefore for the majority of your damage. Now, if you don't have it, you can go alternative sets such as the 4-piece Marishosi Hunter set if you're running Mavuika with Farina, who will drain your HP and allow you to get 36% crit rate and 15% normal and charge attack damage. Outside of that, you can also run the 4-piece Gilded Dreams or 4-piece Crimson Witch of Flames, particularly if you're vaporizing or melting, with other generic sets like Unfinished Reverie with Burning, even though that's not really recommended, or mix and matching 2-piece sets being viable as well. For the most part though, Obsidian Codex is your best and most generalistic option, but other 4-pieces can be viable as well. Now, for a support or sub DPS Mavuika, here you have mainly 2 options. Firstly, the generalistic supportive artifact set will be the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City. This set gives a ton of stats to any elements involved in a reaction that you trigger, meaning that once you trigger a pyro reaction on Mavuika, you will gain elemental damage bonus, in fact 40% to be exact, for both pyro and whatever other element you triggered a reaction with. This is really nice for Mavuika's personal damage and also whatever other DPS you're running, making it a great choice for your team. Because of this, it's the general go-to supportive option for a Natland support. With that in mind though, I want to include a pretty big disclaimer that if you're running another Natland support in your team, it can be more efficient to give the hero set to them and give Mavuika an offensive set instead. If you already have a hero set user in your team, you can consider Obsidian Codex on Mavuika or basically any of the other offensive sets we mentioned, like Gilded Dreams, Crimson Witch of Flames, or mix and matching 2-piece sets. Do keep in mind though that for the Obsidian Codex set, while the uptime of this set is only really good when you're on field, field, because that's how you trigger the 4-piece. Because you get so many stats, 40% crit rate, and it lasts for 6 seconds, this ends up being fine and still your best DPS option because of how much of Mavuika's damage is front-loaded. And so while Mavuika has a ton of options that you can use as viable alternatives, generally her best damage dealing set will be the Obsidian Codex as a main DPS, or even as an off-fielder if you already have someone on the Scroll of the Hero set, whereas her general best supportive set will be this hero set that you can run to give both your Mavuika and also your other damage dealers a huge damage buff. Now moving on, for the stats you want on Mavuika, here's what you need to know. Firstly, it's important to reemphasize that Mavuika does not need energy recharge. Because her burst costs fighting spirit and not energy, energy recharge is not needed and not wanted on any piece. The stats you are looking for, however, are crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, and elemental mastery, provided you are triggering reactions such as melt or vaporize. Because of this, she's built like a very standard DPS who doesn't need energy. In fact, for your main stats, you're going to be looking for pyro damage bonus on your goblet, crit damage or crit rate on your circlet, both being good, but keep in mind that you may already have a lot of crit rate through things like your Obsidian Codex set and substats, so a crit damage circlet may be more popular, but obviously both crit rate and crit damage are viable. And then for your sands, here you can go for either elemental mastery or attack percent. While attack percent will be the most quote-unquote general option because it's always good, if you are vaporizing or melting, which you oftentimes will be doing on Mavuika as we've seen, then elemental mastery can generally be slightly better than attack percent, usually around 5 to 7% or so, because it really helps to maximize your reaction damage, on top of it also being harder to get EM than attack through your team's buffs. Generally, you'll get a lot of attack through external sources like Bennett, Pyro Resonance, and maybe an artifact set, and also her Ascension 1 passive, which gives her some attack as well. And so getting more elemental mastery is oftentimes very valuable. Now, if you already have a ton of EM on your substats, or especially on your weapon, then attack percent could be better for you, on top of it also being just a pretty solid generalistic option. Generally though, if you are triggering these reactions, elemental mastery is slightly favored. And it's worth emphasizing that if you're an off-field quote-unquote support who's enabling your on-field character to trigger reactions and aren't getting many on Mavuika herself, then obviously you'd favor attack percent on your sands, only choosing elemental mastery if Mavuika herself is managing to melt or vaporize her burst, and ideally some of her skill hits as well. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Mavuika's best weapons for every type of player. Firstly, I want to re-emphasize that on a similar note to her artifacts, her weapon choices are pretty similar regardless of if you're playing her as an on-field DPS or an off-field quote-unquote sub-DPS or support. In either case, you're trying to maximize your Mavuika's damage, which means going for the most offensive stats possible. The only thing that will vary is the value of the elemental mastery stat, which is really good if you are melting or vaporizing, and more or less useless if you're not. With that in mind, let's now go over her weapon options. Firstly, 1,000 Blazing Suns, her signature weapon, is obviously going to be her best in slot. This weapon gives you the highest base attack of 741 on top of 11% crit rate, which is a very small amount of crit rate, but it's made up for by the incredibly high base attack and also the fact that as a Natlan character, you really don't want too much crit rate on your weapon, generally speaking, because you get a ton for free from the Obsidian Codex set. So weapons that give you too much crit rate, like some that we'll talk about shortly, can make it more difficult for you to build your artifacts and not overcap on crit rate. 11% is really not that much though, so it's easy to play around, although seeing just a small crit rate stat isn't as satisfying visually, but that doesn't really matter. And on top of just the stat line, this weapon gives you a huge amount of stats on its effect. In fact, this weapon gives you 20% crit damage and 28% attack as a baseline, but this will actually be increased by 75% provided the active characters inside of the Night Soul Blessing state, which Mavuika will be, giving her a total of 35% crit damage and 49% attack on top of the stats you're getting at a baseline. Because of this, this weapon is really great for Mavuika, and it also has good uptime, provided you're dealing elemental damage with your normal or charge attacks, which Mavuika is doing. Overall, this will be your best in slot weapon on Mavuika, being about 20 to 30% better than a free-to-play option, and about 10 to 20% better than her other 5-star options, depending on what you have. So overall, it is a solid signature that definitely is good for Mavuika if you want to increase her damage. Now, if you don't have it though, don't worry. You don't need it for Mavuika to be good, as she does have many other solid weapons that you can use. Firstly, as far as other 5-stars go, the Beacon of the Reed Sea is generally the best. Now, there is a caveat here, which is that it has a really high amount of crit rate, 33%, that you're getting on its stat line. While this weapon gives you a lot of stats, not just the crit rate, but also attack through its effect, having 33% crit rate on a character who's running the Obsidian Codex set makes it to where, when you add it all up and factor in the 5% crit rate you start with, you start at almost 80% crit rate, 78.1% to be exact, making it to where this weapon is insane if you can manage that on your artifacts and not overcap on crit rate, but this can be a bit harder to do in practice, as you no longer will be looking for crit rate on that many pieces, only a few rolls of it here and there. This This weapon can make building your Mavuika a bit more difficult, but if you can do it, it will be your second best 5-star option and generally just a good stat stick. On a similar note, Verdict can be really good, this time giving you a higher base attack with less crit rate, making it easier to build around. This weapon will also offer you attack on its effect and elemental skill damage, which mostly helps you when you're off field. Redhorn Stone Thresher is a 5-star that provides you with a huge amount of crit damage, so honestly another really nice option that also will give you some charge attack damage on its effect. That is a nice little bonus. These are the 3 quote-unquote best 5-stars for Mavuika generally speaking, but outside of them there are other decent stat sticks. Wolf's Gravestone or Unforged can be solid attack percent stat sticks, giving you just a ton of attack, especially if you're shielded for Unforged and just in general for Wolves. But keep in mind that Mavuika already gains so much attack percent in her optimal teams by running someone like Bennett, the Pyro Resonance, and maybe even Thrilling Tales, on top of getting some from her first Ascension passive, that you can get diminishing returns on more attack, making it less valuable than other stats. Generally though, there's still good options, performing similarly to your 4-star options, so pretty decent if you already have them leveled. Lastly, Kanicha's weapon, Fang of the Mountain King, can be used as well for base stats, and an effect that will only buff you if you're triggering Burning or Burgeon, which you oftentimes won't be, but the stats on it make it viable. Now moving on for the 4-star and free-to-play options that Mavuika has, you should know that there's quite a few good ones. Firstly, Serpent Spine is a no-brainer. This is a battle pass weapon that is pretty much a staple on a lot of Claymore characters if you choose to get the battle pass, as it gives you a lot of damage through its effect. Now this is a weapon that gets better at high refinement, and also provided you can maintain its stack up time, so by either not getting hit as much or crucially waiting a bit before starting an Abyss Chamber while your Serpent Spine stacks up. But if you can make use of all the stats it gives you, then it is one of your best and potentially your best 4-star option. Now it is worth pointing out though that again with Serpent Spine you are getting a lot of crit rate, 27.6 to be exact, so you can run into the same problem as with other crit rate weapons where it may be harder to build your artifacts. Generally though, it's just a good 4-star option. Outside of that, for some free-to-play weapon choices that perform really well as well, firstly there's the Mailed Flower, which is an event weapon that unfortunately is no longer obtainable, but it kind of happened relatively recently, so maybe you got it, and if you did, it's great for Mavuika. It gives you a ton of elemental mastery and attack, making it your best free-to-play option if you can use the elemental mastery, meaning if you are melting or vaporizing. With this weapon you can go for an attack percent sans and just get pretty solid performance out of it. If you don't have it, the Rain Slasher can be similar in strength at high refinement, with Mailed Flowers performing similarly when fully refined. Now if you don't have Mailed Flowers though, fear not, because Tidal Shadow is a weapon you can craft and refine anytime, and it is a free-to-play option that performs very similarly to Mailed Flowers. Tidal Shadow is a weapon that will give you a ton of attack percent, notably when you're being healed. Keep in mind this works with overhealing, so as long as you're getting healing from any of your healers on your team, thinking of someone like Shieldin, Chevris, or even Bennett if you're also running Farina to drain your HP down, as Bennett won't heal you when you're already full HP, then Tidal Shadow can have good uptime and will give you a ton of attack, making it a very competitive option with your other 4-star choices and your best generic craftable free-to-play option that I can recommend. The free-to-play options include Blackcliff Slasher, which gives you crit damage and some attack provided you can stack it up, so honestly a viable option, or even Prototype Archaic or the Melusine Sword, although they're less recommended and the Melusine Sword's ER stat will be completely wasted, so it's just for the attack. Outside of that, you can also run Talking Stick as an alternative battle pass weapon to Serpent Spine, being decent for melt or vaporize teams, although I wouldn't recommend choosing it from the battle pass. Additionally, the Mach Hyra Claymore can provide you with a ton of elemental mastery, converting some of it into attack as well, being a viable option that gets better with refinements. With that out of the way, I'm going to put a weapon ranking on screen now to help you get a rough idea of what to expect from each different weapon. Now keep in mind that this should be used to get a general idea and not an exact one, as the exact ranking will vary for you based on your team, weapons, rotation, artifacts, and so much more. I put 2 weapon rankings, one in a melt team, one in a vape team, and a thanks to Jeff77 for the math behind these. Alright, now next up for Mavuika's Constellations and what you should go for, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Mavuika's power as a character is really high even at C0, so never feel forced to get Constellations, and upgrades to your team are also very valuable if you are looking to get other characters, for example, that you're missing. With that in mind, she is someone who has a really good early stopping point with her second constellation. In fact, to look at them, for Mavuika's first constellation, here she will have her max Night Soul points increased to 120, while also gaining Fighting Spirit stacks 25% more efficiently. This will firstly act as a band-aid if you aren't running good Natland supports with your Mavuika, allowing her to get her burst back by herself much easier. This can allow her to run in more teams, and also because you get more Night Soul points, this will make her skill last longer, which translates to more pyro hits as an off-fielder, more uptime from your skill as a support. Outside of just that, Mavuika will gain 40% attack through this constellation, which is a pretty good amount of stats, make it a decent C1 with its exact strength varying based on on what you're doing. With that in mind, her second constellation is the crazy one. This will give Mavuika an extra 200 base attack, and because this is base attack, it's actually nicer than you might think, as any attack percent you're gaining will scale on your base attack, so always nice to have more. With the second part of this constellation doing one of two things. Firstly, for your tap skill, it will decrease the opponent's defense by 20%, and a def shred is always appreciated, so it's a nice universal increase to your team's damage by reducing the defense of enemies. More importantly though, at least in my opinion, is the second part here, where when you're riding your bike, your normal charge attacks and your burst slice will deal 60, 90, and 120% of her attack as increased damage respectively. This makes it to where basically all of your hits as a main DPS will deal quite a bit more damage, translating to around a 30 to 40% personal damage increase to your Mavuika. This is honestly really good as far as the C2 goes, making Mavuika that much stronger. Now keep in mind that it is good, but I don't want anyone to feel forced or baited to get a constellation, so just keep that in mind. Now as far as vertical investment goes, if you're wondering what to pull to upgrade your Mavuika and her teams, firstly, I'd say that getting a good support for her and also your account in general is the #1 priority. Outside of that, your second constellation is definitely better than your signature weapon, with your signature weapon being better than your first constellation. So C2 is better than R1, but R1 is better than C1, although C2 can be more expensive. Moving on, Mavuika's C3 and 5 increase her talent levels, C3 increasing her burst, and C5 increasing her skill, both of which being okay. And then Mavuika's C4 will make her damage buff passive better. In fact, will give you a flat 50% damage bonus to whoever your active character is, being nice as a support, but also benefiting you as a DPS. It's not the biggest increase, but it's more damage for your on-fielder. Lastly, for Mavuika's C6, this is a pretty strong one overall. Firstly, it'll buff both her off-field and on-field hits, giving you more damage from off-field, having a motorcycle crash into opponents as your ring hits them, and then also more damage from on-field with kind of the reverse effect, having a ring follow you, dealing bonus damage, and also reducing opponents' defense by 20%, which is honestly pretty good. Lastly, the C6 also gives you an exploration bonus, allowing you to regen Night Soul points out of combat. Overall, Mavuika is someone with good constellations, notably having a great stopping point at C2 if that's something you're interested in. Overall though, she's a solid unit even at C0, so don't feel forced to get any. Alright, now with all that out of the way, let's into one of the most important sections of the video, covering Mavuika's best teams and synergies. Now in this section, we're obviously going to talk about Mavuika's best teams, both as a DPS and also as an off-field support, so we're really going to try to cover everything. Now firstly, as mentioned earlier in the video, and as I'm sure you know by now, as a main DPS, Mavuika typically will really want Bennett. This is because Bennett is just such an efficient buffer for her, giving her a huge amount of attack through his burst, an artifact set, and also the pyro resonance, while additionally acting as a healer. For these reasons, Bennett is oftentimes included in the vast majority of her best teams as a great 4-star option. Outside of just Bennett though, Mavuika definitely wants at least one Natlan support in order to generate fighting spirit stacks for her. Because of this, the best options are the 2 5-star Natlan supports that are just great characters overall. I mentioned this earlier, but Shilodin and Sidlali are both very strong supports, both of which offering you massive buffs. Either one you're running can run the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City set, with Shilodin offering you res shred, some more healing, even though you already have Bennett, and also very fast Night Soul point consumption. Sidlali on the other hand will give you Night Soul points as well, and will also offer you a plethora of buffs. She'll give you res shred, cryo application, which is enough to enable you to melt your burst and some hits, really making your damage much higher, being the best cryo character for Mavuika, while also giving you a very comfy shield, having good personal damage as well, and additional buffs through either her signature weapon or the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. Do note that regarding Sidlali's cryo application, she'll have enough to ensure that you melt Mavuika's burst and then get a couple of melt hits off when you're spinning as well. You can get 2 normally or 4 if you do the jump cancel that I talked about earlier in the video, and if not, you can also consider running a second cryo character if you want to help apply even more cryo. In general though, Sidlali can be enough while also giving you a ton of buffs, a shield, and Night Soul point consumption, making her an excellent support for Mavuika. Now, for all those reasons, if you have either Shilonen or Sidlali, running one or both of them in Mavuika's teams is definitely recommended. Now, if you don't have them, that's fine, we'll cover that too, but for the basics, you typically want Bennett and then at least one Natlan support character. Outside of that, you are typically going to build a team that revolves around an archetype, usually a reaction that you're going for. Typically for Mavuika as a DPS, she has the best synergy with the melt and vaporize reactions, as we talked about throughout the video. For those reasons, you would want either a cryo or hydro support. For a melt team, you can run something like this, where you're running Mavuika, Bennett, Sidlali, and then a flexible last slot. This could be Shilonen as an incredible buffer, but it could also be an Anemo buffer like Kazu or Sucrose, or just any generic flex option like Zhongli or another cryo. Now, if you don't have Sidlali, you could either play a vaporize team or still play melt, but running someone like Rosé Rosaria instead, or just another generic cryo unit who will apply cryo and still enable you to melt at least your burst and a few other hits. Rosaria works well here, and Kaya can work here too, by the way. Diona can also be nice for some EM, and potentially as a double cryo option alongside Sitlali for more melts. And obviously, Shilinen would be a great last slot, but if you don't have her, then Kachina can make for a free-to-play friendly option, giving your Mavuika a viable team with less premium options. Now, outside of that, you can also run Mavuika in a vaporized team, with her best hydro support being Farina. Farina gives her massive damage buffs, has good personal damage as well, and will enable your Mavuika to vaporize consistently. For more information on how to vaporize and melt most of your hits, do refer to the rotation section of this video where I went over it, but for the most part, Farina just is your best hydro support option because Mavuika is someone who is spam charge attacking, and on top of just applying hydro, Farina also has buffs, which is great. Also, further testing has proven that Yelan can work as a great hydro support as well, but only if you're doing the 2 charge attack dash combo that I showed earlier. This is because both Yelan and Xingqiu's rain arrows will only fire off of your normal attack animation, which will be possible on your first charge attack. So if you're constantly dashing and resetting your combo, it'll work. Whereas if you just stay on Mavuika and just hold your charge attack, keep spinning around in a more standard way, then they won't be good supports for you. And then your last slot here will once again be flexible, but you do really want a Natlan support. So someone like Shilinen is amazing, or you could also run Sitlali. And if you don't have either, then even running someone like Auroron as a 4-star option definitely works. Here you can get electrocharged and vaporized as well, provided you're managing your rotation correctly, and Auroron will help your Mavuika get her burst back, on top of being able to run the hero artifact set to really increase your damage significantly. Outside of that, if you want to play a melt or vaporize team and don't have any of the best hydro cryo options that I mentioned, there are a lot of off-fielders that can work. Anyone who will apply enough hydro can definitely enable you to get some vaporizes in your rotation. Cryo options like Diona or even a support Ganyu can technically work, and I've even seen it clear of a full energy recharge Aito's burst, giving you enough hydro to vaporize on your Mavuika. So again, there's a lot you can do here, with the best options naturally being the best supports like Farina and Sitlali, although as a 4-star, Rosaria is great too. Now outside of that, you can also run Mavuika in an overload team alongside Chevris and Auroron. In these teams, Auroron will be your Natlan support, you'll have Bennett to give you buffs, or you could run another Pyro if your Bennett's not available, and then Chevy to give you massive buffs as well, with this team being great at a baseline but getting a lot better with Constellations on these 4-star characters that give you even more buffs. Now outside of that, while I do recommend running Mavuika in reaction teams, personally I think it's where she shines the most and where she's the best. You can also run her in a mono Pyro team if you want to, or don't have the units necessary for the other teams. In a team like this, you will run Mavuika typically with Bennett and 1 Natlan support, and then you have a very flexible last slot. For your Natlan character, Shilinen will naturally be the best, but if you don't have her, you can run someone like Kachina or the Pyro Traveler, although admittedly, I do need to test the Pyro Traveler out a bit more. Outside of that, you can run flex options such as Xiangling, Kazuha, Zhongli, a generic Geo character, or even Emily for some burning. And even though charge attacking is her optimal playstyle, if you want to plunge on her, you can with Shen Yun, as it is kind of funny and surprisingly viable. Now regarding Mavuika as a support, the sky really is the limit in the sense that you can run her in basically any team that wants an off-field Pyro applier. You can use her tap skill and her burst and get a lot of value just from that. Because of this, Mavuika can be ran alongside many carries such as Chaska, having good burst damage and also enabling certain reactions, with these two teams being surprisingly strong. Outside of that, you can run Mavuika with Moalani, having enough Pyro to enable her to vaporize consistently and be a great team overall. Keep in mind that if you're running double Hydro Moalani, Mavuika won't have enough Pyro, so if you're running Yelan, Candice, or Farina, then you would want Xiangling instead, but for general Moalani teams, Mavuika works great. She can also work with Kanich, although keep in mind that triggering the hero set can be a bit inconsistent in your second rotation if enemies are already burning, as reapplying burning won't trigger the set's effect as it doesn't count as a reaction, but as long as you can work around that, and even just in general, Mavuika can be a good support for Kanich, giving him massive buffs when you do manage to trigger the hero set on top of everything else. Outside of that, Mavuika can work with Navia, typically just bursting and swapping out, although I have seen some talk about potentially using Mavuika as a dual DPS in this team and spending some time on her, but in my experience, I've gotten more value playing her as more of a support here, as if I wanted to play Mavuika as a DPS, I just build her as a DPS, but you can do dual carry teams if you want and spend a bit of time on each, but I do like to focus on Navia and maximize her crystallizes. Outside of that, reverse melt teams work with either Risley or Ganyu or just any generic cryo carry, and I think that Mavuika is a nice upgrade to Risley teams. Mavuika can also work with Nevalette, enabling the occasional vaporize, and she can also work in an overload team as an off-field pyro. She also works with other pyro carries in mono pyro teams or variations of it, where she can just be another good pyro character. Obviously, if the last slot here is Farina, your Farina will get some vaporizes, but it could also be the generic mono pyro slots like a Geo, Anemo, or Dendro support, which all work. And lastly, Mavuika can also work in conversion teams as an off-field pyro option. Overall, while I didn't name every single carry that fits these elements or reaction-based teams, you kind of get the point, and Mavuika can really work in a lot of teams as an off-field support. Now keep in mind that if you have the right team for her, sometimes it might be better DPS to just play your Mavuika as the damage dealer instead, but obviously if you enjoy a certain main DPS and want to run her off-field or use her for her burst and then swap out, then that can definitely make sense for you. And Mavuika is a very versatile character that has a lot of teams where she shines. Now with that said, we're going to move into a Mavuika DPS showcase in this abyss, and I do want to include a disclaimer though that Mavuika, while she is really strong, the current abyss is just one of the worst ones we've ever seen, not just in general but also for her in particular. This isn't because it's necessarily hard, but there's just a lot of restrictions that make it more annoying for Mavuika in particular. The first half has a ton of pyro resistant enemies and other annoying requirements, and then the second half is a lot nicer for Mavuika, but still in the third chamber you need a bow character to take down the Aeon Blight Drake, or Farina can do it, albeit not the most consistently, but it isn't the biggest deal. And what we're actually going to do in the showcase is include a premium team with Sitlali for 12-1 and 12-2, and then for 12-3 I'll be using a bow character, namely Yelan, to shoot down the Aeon Blight Drake. My Mavuika will be played with the following build. So she's C0 without her signature. She's on Red Horn, so just a random 5-star stat stick that I have on the Obsidian Codex set, and also importantly 6-8 talents. This is because she requires a new weekly boss which has just come out, so even though I will be doing over 1 million damage with my burst sometimes, keep in mind that this number could even be higher if I manage to crown her burst, which will happen in the coming weeks, on top of also leveling her skill. So keep in mind that she could get stronger, but obviously I have really good investment, so I'm at over 300 crit damage thanks to the crit damage weapon that I'm running, and also have a crit rate of 85 when you factor in the Obsidian Codex set, enough EM, and relatively low attack that will get buffed through supports like Bennett, so that really isn't that big of a deal. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go. And so yeah, as you can see, Mavuika is a really strong main DPS, genuinely one that I believe is pretty broken, especially in the right teams, and also is a really strong support. I want to say that this guide took way too long to make. I'm sorry for the delay. I'll try to be faster for future videos. A lot of time and effort went into it, especially the combo section and all the extra stuff I had to add. So if you appreciate it and enjoyed the video, a like would be very much appreciated. With that said, stay tuned for my Sitlali guide, hopefully coming out very soon. And if there's anything new that's discovered or that I want to add with regards to Mavuika, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. As always, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. I'll try to be faster in the future, and I hope this guide was helpful. Thanks again, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.